Spider-Man Miles Morales is the superior Spider-Man video game. Despite how this newish expansion to Insomniac's 2018 Marvel Spider-Man title is overall a smaller game in terms of narrative size and breadth of content, Spider-Man Miles Morales' comparatively more miniature nature allows the story and the gameplay pacing to be an incredibly focused experience, which admittedly is a core attribute that was more lacking in the behemoth-sized main game. See, Marvel's Spider-Man featured a lot of the typical Ubisoft-style open-world busywork that plagues many big-budget open-world titles, and unfortunately, they diluted some of the better aspects of the game. There was an overabundance of watchtower sequences, enemy stronghold missions, and a plethora of other narratively meaningless side quests. But in Spider-Man Miles Morales, a lot of the open-world nonsense that was present in the main game has either been removed or at the very least decreased with extreme prejudice, and the newer title is all the better for it. Instead of having an overflowing checklist of stuff to do that needlessly pads out the runtime, Spider-Man Miles Morales lasers in on what made Marvel's Spider-Man a good game, which is to say the good, albeit problematic story, the terrific combat, the inherent joy of web-swinging through open-world New York, and incredibly detailed side quests. Sure, Spider-Man Miles Morales is a smaller and shorter game, but the majorly reduced amount of busywork allows the player to constantly engage in the game's more meaningful content much more frequently than in the main game, and as a result, the game is pretty damn good. Actually, it's really good in fact. Like, it's as if the best qualities of Marvel's Spider-Man have been amplified, much like the tinnitus-inducing sound check at an Alice in Chains concert, which is a compliment to both Spider-Man Miles Morales and Alice in Chains. Furthermore, Spider-Man Miles Morales' smaller size especially affects the gameplay pacing and the game's rewarding upgrade system in a positive manner. Even though the main game's great mix of Arkham Asylum style of rhythmic combats and fluid stealth action is still present here and remains mostly unchanged, the upgrade systems in Spider-Man Miles Morales are much more streamlined. See, in the main game there was a near overwhelming amount of level ups, spider suit abilities, and tech upgrades. In fact, the game threw so much stuff at the player that it was kind of difficult to keep track of all of Peter's abilities when in the thick of fighting various supervillains or enemies within Marvel's underworld. Yet Spider-Man Miles Morales' shorter nature inherently lessens the amount of upgrades to the point that it actually benefited the game in its sense of pace. The various level ups, skill points, upgrades, and etc. are easy to keep track of in this new game and are given out at a very rewarding pace, which reels the player in long term, keeping them engaged unlike Bill Gates. In fact, the great upgrade system keeps the gameplay manageable, and as a result, Spider-Man Miles Morales swings around at a great pace. There is just enough depth to the upgrade and level up system to maintain a good sense of game progression, all while also not being too much to the point that it overwhelms the player with a bliss of upgrades that are difficult to keep track of, which is impressive because it's a really tough balance. But Spider-Man Miles Morales does it well. So well, in fact, that Spider-Man Miles Morales didn't really need to update its gameplay formula all that much in order to be a compelling experience. In fact, most of Spider-Man Miles Morales' gameplay remains very similar to the base game's fun combats that involves punching, grappling, and juggling. And honestly, Spider-Man Miles Morales only needed to add a few tweaks here and there to justify an all-new gaming experience. After all, web-swinging through New York's various neighborhoods, the dynamic versatile combat, and the stealth sequences that outdo Arkham Asylum remain a highlight and were already a winning formula. And the addition of Miles' shock powers, the Spider-Man app that helps keep track of the side quests, and the game's winter holiday setting were just the light touches necessary that allows Spider-Man Miles Morales to feel like a new entry that is very much worth playing, which is high praise indeed. However, even though the gameplay is smooth, rewarding, and slick, Spider-Man Miles Morales would need context to truly leave an emotional impact. It would need a narrative reason for the player to get truly invested in the game's action, aside from how great it controls. So with that, here is the context. The plot follows young college student Miles Morales and takes place half a year after the main game ended, where Miles revealed to Peter Parker, i.e. the original Spider-Man, that he has been bitten by a radioactive spider and had gained super superpowered abilities, and ever since then, Miles has been training with Peter, essentially learning the ropes, or the webs rather, of what it takes to be a good Spider-Man and understanding the occupational uniquities of the job, such as fighting crime, saving innocent bystanders, and shooting sticky white fluid across New York City, just like all young New Yorkers have done for generations. And with all these important nuances to the job, the training program goes fairly well, even though eventually Miles soon has his work cut out for him. See, Peter leaves on a lengthy vacation, which means that Miles has to be the proverbial Spider-Man of the house, and with Peter gone, the web-encrusted training wheels have come off, meaning that Miles must defend New York from those who would do harm to the city, which there are quite a few baddies to confront. After all, it would be a pretty dull game if Miles was just sitting on his ass twiddling his spider thumbs the whole time. So with that, the plot kicks into full swing when Miles discovers a growing tension between two of the city's newest power players. One is the Roxxon Energy Corporation, who is engaged in some really shady business practices, and on the other side is the Tinkerer, who is a mysterious unidentified extremist willing to confront Roxxon by any means necessary. And between the two, it is up to Miles to uncover the reasons for the conflict and put a stop to it before anyone gets hurt, which is an act that would prove to the city and himself that he is worthy of being Spider-Man. As far as main plots go, Spider-Man Miles Morales has a lot of heart. The game contains some very likable characters and has a narrative where Miles undergoes some strong character growth. In fact, throughout the game, Miles' various relationships with his aspiring politician of a mother, Rio, his complicated friendship with Finn, his best friend and confidant, Ganke, and his ex-con uncle Aaron are all tested, and Miles must confront these character dilemmas all while also fulfilling his duty as the new Spider-Man, which is a role that carries a lot of significance. After all, Miles is more than just a second Spider-Man. He has Venom shock powers and the ability to turn invisible, all alongside his more typical Spider-Man abilities. If anything, he is the superior Spider-Man. He has more potential to be more powerful than Peter and has more capabilities. Yet Miles' role as Spider-Man has a far more important attribute than just having a different set of powers. See, Miles is of mixed race. He is black and Hispanic and lives in Harlem, which is a neighborhood that is predominantly made up of marginalized people. And seeing as Miles lives there, he takes on jobs and fights crime in that area of the city far more often than Peter does, and as a result, Miles becomes endeared to that part of the city. He is often referred to as our Spider-Man by many of Harlem's residents, a hero that looks out for folks who are so often overlooked by the rest of the city and is of similar ethnic background as them. And honestly, it's really great representation. Much of the game's story, side quests, visual and audio art style reflects the inherent themes of diversity and how the game stars a protagonist who is from a racial background that is all too often overlooked in the AAA video game space, and it is great to see, even though it is imperfect. Unfortunately, Spider-Man Miles Morales has one big problem in terms of its narrative framing. While the representation of a multiracial Spider-Man being the guardian of New York's overlooked population is great, the core presentation of the story's main conflict is very flawed. See, the turf war between the corrupt and unregulated Roxxon Energy Corporation and the Tinkerer has some issues, mostly because Miles, and by extension the game's internal politics, basically designates both sides as being villainous. Even though the Tinkerer's goals of combating the exploitative Roxxon Corporation are sympathetic, the game presents the Tinkerer as an extremist and criticizes their actions as being too radical. And while sure, Miles empathizes with the Tinkerer's goals, the game narratively stresses how the Tinkerer and their followers should take on the Roxxon Corporation through the correct, approved, and legal way. He believes that the Tinkerer must fight Roxxon through more appropriate avenues, which, to be blunt, is a very hypocritical viewpoint coming from a damn vigilante. Like, let's be honest here, Spider-Man breaks numerous laws every time he dons the spider suit, yet Miles has the gall to tell the Tinkerer to do their activism through the proper channels, which is a very rich line of reasoning coming from Spider-Man, you know, the superpowered dude that regularly circumvents the proper authorities and fights crime on his own terms. It is a big cognitive dissonance. Furthermore, I wish Spider-Man Miles Morales' narrative framed the Tinkerer far differently differently. See, in the game, the Tinker cares about Harlem just as much as Miles does. While sure, the Tinker is portrayed as a sympathetic villain whose pursuit of justice can blind them to the various dangers they pose to New York, their heart is in the right place, and I often found myself wishing Miles would offer them a helping hand more often than not. Sure, some of their means are extreme, but I often felt that Miles could reason with the Tinker if he viewed them in a less adversarial manner, because to be honest, the Roxxon corporation that both of them are fighting poses a much bigger threat to New York. And sure, Spider-Man Miles Morales manufactures a reason for Miles to fight the Tinker's forces throughout the game, the narrative and the characters did not need to be framed this way. They didn't need to be enemies because, to be honest, Simon Krieger and the Roxxon Corporation are the only antagonistic force that this story really needs. The company is cold-hearted, unethical, and armed to the teeth. They are the perfect bad guys. But Spider-Man Miles Morales equates both the Roxxon Corporation and those being oppressed by Roxxon as two equal and opposing forces to be fought when that clearly should not be the case. The Tinkerer and their followers have an understandable grievance with how Roxxon is expanding their operation and taking advantage of the marginalized communities within Harlem. Yet Miles chastises them for not fighting Roxxon in a more approvable legal manner and unceremoniously dispatches the Tinkerer's followers as if they were any other criminal despite their cause being just. And all while doing this, Miles further touts how the Tinkerer and their followers should do things the correct and legal way, which is ridiculous because that is a moral double standard that Miles doesn't even apply to himself. Sad as it is to say, the Amazing Spider-Man stands as an amazing contradiction here. Spider-Man Miles Morales is a true expansion to Marvel's Spider-Man, and I mean that as both a compliment and a little bit of a detriment. On one hand, the game features the same great combat system, terrific stealth action, and a lively open-world New York City that I hope Insomniac recycles for other New York-based Marvel superheroes in future games, kind of like how Sega reuses a similar map in the Yakuza series. On the other hand, though, Spider-Man Miles Morales' narrative is thematically inconsistent. Sure, it hits a home run when it comes to representation and its commitment to diversity, but the game's presentation of its core conflict is very flawed, which is admittedly very much an extension of the problems with the main game. After all, in the main game, Peter Parker is an unapologetic ally to the police, which is just bad optics after the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, and sadly, Spider-Man Miles Morales has similar problematic messaging in regards to its political centrism, which is an unfortunate political viewpoint that prevents the narrative from being as impactful as it otherwise could have been. While for sure Spider-Man Miles Morales is worth playing for its stellar gameplay alone, its narrative and its presentation of the conflict prevent the title from achieving true greatness. Hey y'all, that was the video. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like rating and subscribe to my channel. Ring the bell so that you're notified whenever I post a video, and please consider checking out my Patreon. The link is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my high-tier patrons and Slasher Bales, Mom, and David Devlin. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.